Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. I'm your host, Robby Valderrama. On this show, we love to highlight creative cross-cultural solutions, and in light of COVID-19, an important question has emerged. What role should individuals, businesses, and governments play in finding solutions for this global health crisis, and who should decide? To help us answer this question, I invited my old friends, Ben Walker and Ian Patterson, on the show. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome, guys. Ben, Ian, good to see you both.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Hey, Robby.
It's super fun to have you guys on the show. The world is changing quickly, and it's fun to get to reconnect with old friends. I go back pretty far with both of you. Ben, you and I have known each other since high school, played in jazz band together. Yeah. I've always respected your level-headed take on life, your insatiable curiosity, and your desire to think both deeply and compassionately about important issues. So happy to have you on the show.
You should talk to my wife. You make me sound amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ian, I think you and I first connected when you led worship at a San Jose State University worship night back in maybe like 2006 or something like that. Was that right?
I think that's right.
It's almost like we're old or something. Over the last, I guess, almost 15 years, Ian, I've constantly been challenged by your Facebook posts on theological and political issues. And I've got a lot of respect for the way that you're not afraid to tackle tough issues, both with clarity and a caring heart. So happy to have you on the show as well.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
So before we get kicked off with any like content specific questions, just to give our listeners a feel for who you guys are and what you're up to, then when you're not pulling open your yearbook and reminiscing about how awesome our high school experience was, what are you up to these days?
Well, believe it or not, with the COVID situation, I have been going through old yearbooks and folders. Like last week, I was texting old college friends of like, hey, here's the notes we were screwing around off in class. Outside of, typical world events, what I tend to do in my day-to-day life is work for a hospital consulting firm. We help hospitals with electricity and natural gas purchases, on-site use of energy, so efficiency, those kind of things, and then starting to delve into questions of sustainability and resiliency. So a lot of my knowledge comes from the energy side, U.S. energy policy, and how hospitals navigate that.
That's so cool. That's so cool. And Ian, what's been keeping you busy these days?
Well, I've spent about 13 years in startup land. I have the tattoos and the scars to show for it. But I'm head of product now for a tech company that kind of sits at the intersection of policy, trying to bypass bad policy with technology is basically what we do. And that's called Lincoln Studio.
That's fascinating. I think we've got a lot to talk about today. We've got the engineer, Ben, from Salt Lake City, and Ian, the designer in Silicon Valley. You both are sharp thinkers. You are political minorities in the areas where you live. And most relevant to our current situation with COVID-19, you've both spent a good chunk of your careers thinking critically about how to improve the healthcare system here in the US. So as we find ourselves in this global health crisis, there are political decisions being made right now that will shape the world for decades, if not centuries to come. And I hope I'm not like exaggerating by saying that. But in this context, what I'm hoping is that your engineering and design skills might help us gain some perspective on the crisis at hand and also create a picture at what a better world could look like moving forward. So first question, what weaknesses has COVID-19 revealed in our healthcare system over the past few months? And what changes would you recommend to maybe better prepare for something like this in the future?
One of the obvious challenges has just been cash flow. We have healthcare clients who are just trying to figure out how to struggle to pay their bills. So they reach out to us and say, hey, that energy contract we signed, what happens if we just stopped paying bills? Would that free up any cash? And we had to tell them like, no, that's not the best rock to look under. The healthcare system in general is, I think, hyper-focused on profitability and efficiency. And so they haven't stockpiled certain equipment to deal with a situation like this. The structural problems, you have to pay for that excess redundant capacity, and they're not incentivized to do that right now. And so as kind of stuff hits the fan, they have to try to problem solve with their hands tied behind their backs a little bit.
Yeah, that's a fascinating angle.
I view the situation as being a lot about being anti-fragile. And that term, I think, is one that's really helpful to understand, that Systems need to be able to respond, and people need to be able to respond to unexpected things and to not only be resilient to them, but to actually get stronger because of challenges like this. When I see the healthcare system, and especially the people that are struggling to financially be able to afford a lot of healthcare that they need right now, and a system that's very limited in terms of its capacity, what I see is that it's not responsive enough to the needs of individuals and the problems that we face right now. So this was unexpected, obviously. You need to have a system that can turn on a dime and immediately start addressing the needs of consumers. What's happened is a little bit like the Lego movie. It's one of my favorite stories of sort of like a metaphor of libertarianism. There's this character who wants to keep gluing down all of the Lego pieces to make them fixed and stable and predictable. And the result is their playfulness, their fun, their utility actually goes away because what you've done is super glued together things that you can no longer play with, you can no longer change and modify. And basically, I see that with the healthcare system, that things have gotten extremely glued down in order to make them predictable, to make them controllable. But that also means that they can be responsive to the needs of people when unexpected things like this come up. There's a need for us to allow freedom so that people can take care of problems that are unexpected like this in a quick way. And I think that this is one of those situations that's really exposed that.
So Ian, walk me through that a little bit. So what would restructuring the system to allow for more freedom look like in a practical manner?
Well, one story that got a fair bit of coverage, I'm happy to say, was how the FDA, for example, has caused some pretty significant problems with the handling of COVID-19. And Reason Magazine's done a lot of good coverage on this. You can go check out some of their stuff. The initial testing for COVID cases in the United States was actually blocked by the FDA. So the FDA did this process of gluing down all the Lego pieces, so to speak, to try to make them predictable and controllable. But the result was the system couldn't respond. So there was a researcher and a clinician apparently in Seattle who identified the first US sort of patient zero in Seattle. She already had some of the resources that she needed to go ahead and do some additional follow-up and testing and to track how far the disease had spread. And she had to apply to do this experiment with the FDA. And the net result was it actually took her weeks and weeks and weeks of them saying, no, you can't do this experiment. You're not allowed to for the following reasons. And finally, she just wound up disobeying and identifying that the disease had spread quite significantly. So she basically broke the law in order to help keep us safe. So that's one of those examples of regulations that people set out to think are going to help us, keep us safe, but they wind up actually making us less safe when those rules are not cross-applicable.
And Ian, in that story, was it, if I remember correctly, there were significant concerns over private information, right? That there's certain information is private to the patients, and exposing that in a time of crisis, we start weighing these difficult decisions of what's the good of society and what's the good of the person.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the challenge is when you have a top-down solution like that, a one-size-fits-all that's imposed on all of society, you can't be responsive and you can't actually weigh the ethical considerations. Did that clinician actually need to weigh the ethical trade-offs of going back through her data to find people who might have COVID-19? No, she got to push that decision off onto the federal government because she didn't have a choice. So in other words, it takes the moral responsibility off of individuals. It puts it onto a system that's not particularly moral and doesn't really think that way. And that strikes me as being a particularly bad trade-off, right? If you really want people to think in terms of what's moral and responsive and ethical, you should allow them to make those choices and have the responsibility for that. If you take away the responsibility through the system, you're actually providing a really perverse incentive for them to make sketchy decisions.
In thinking about COVID-19 and kind of healthcare in general in this country, this idea of perverse incentives to me is fascinating. I think it's well known that healthcare is very expensive in the US and more so than a lot of other countries, and yet our results are still below what other countries are enjoying. I point the finger to perverse incentives, specifically on, I'll say, corporations, so the insurance companies, certain for-profit hospitals, the pharmaceutical research companies. And I question whether if they were to step in and say, we're going to make the moral decisions as our company, if they would actually do that, or if they would just treat the dollar as the only thing to pursue.
Yeah, I think that it's really an issue that's illustrated by what happened with the testing. So as I understand it, CDC and the FDA together essentially blocked anybody from developing private testing. So they monopolized the development of COVID-19 tests. The result was, for weeks, there were no other tests allowed to be developed or tried. And then when the CDC test through the FDA came out and was limited, I think, to just a few hundred available tests, basically those tests failed. They were a complete failure. So we lost weeks and weeks and weeks when days counted to try to do a more targeted, limited approach like South Korea did that was more voluntary. We lost a lot of that opportunity. By the way, I'm not an epidemiologist. This is my personal opinion, but it seems to me like other countries have been very successful using a more targeted approach that protects an open society. And they were able to do that because of the responsiveness of their medical infrastructure and the fact that people were encouraged to do this voluntarily. Like South Korea, they tracked contact. They encouraged everybody to wear masks and to be very careful about their hand hygiene and things like that. In other words, they leveraged responsibility in a society instead of authoritarianism. And it played out very well for them. This is also, I think, the case in a bunch of other countries. Whereas here in the US, the CDC and the FDA blocked all testing for weeks when days counted. When it finally came out that their test didn't work, they finally, and kudos to the Trump administration for this, they allowed other private organizations, private companies to develop their own tests finally. They lifted a ban on that. And what you see in a chart of the number of available tests was that it went from nothing to an absolute hockey stick of amazing supply of tests. Like Abbott, for example, has now a 5-minute self-swab test that has multiple advantages. It's like 98% accurate within 15 minutes or something like that. And this all happened in a matter of days or weeks after the FDA lifted that ban. But that's one of those examples of like a rule that was a top-down approach, one size fits all, and it made us all less safe as a result.
I've got an interesting kind of recent story. A couple of weeks ago, we had a tornado that hit down in Nashville. I think it was actually 3, like in level 2, level 3, and level 4. Thankfully, it was a little bit away from our family's home, but there's a lot of communities that got hit really hard. Out of that, there was this complete destruction for blocks on blocks. Houses just, it looked like a war zone. It was the most amazing thing to see. When you put out a social media post asking for volunteers, you got double the amount you needed. When you put out a social media post asking for resources or financial donations, you got double what you asked for. There's a reason they call Tennessee the volunteer state, I found out. People were happy to help. And that decentralized approach was incredible. In like 3 to 4 days, what got rebuilt was astounding. I mean, it literally would have taken the government months and months to do that. Now, on the flip side, what we started running into is chaos at the same time. But one house would get asked like 10 times by a different organization, hey, can we help you? No. Like, hey, can we help you? No. Like, oh, what do you need? Please stop talking to us. And so you had that downside where we're like, man, I wish somebody would just take responsibility and maybe like close off the streets and say, all right, we need to bring some order to this. Here's the people that are in charge. Let's station police officers there and only let people through if they're doing X, Y, and Z. Keep a centralized list of what's happening. So in that example for me, I saw the pros and the cons of both a more centralized as well as a decentralized approach. And ultimately, that problem didn't get solved until the centralized approach came in and it laid some order to the neighborhoods and said, here's what needs to happen. So using that as a parallel, I think we kind of know broadly which direction each of you guys will lean in this conversation. But using that as a parallel, what do you see the role of local communities and individuals being in this fight versus the government in this fight against COVID-19?
I would make a distinction between which form of government you're asking about. There's a natural tension that was designed and written into our Constitution between federal and state, but not just between federal and state. Each state has its own constitution, right? So then it cascades down into the county and into the city. I know that in my city of Salt Lake City, Utah, the mayor has been hesitant to issue a stay-at-home order because she wants to work with the county and the county wants to work with the state. And so the mayor of our city says, we're the capital city. We represent a large portion of the population. And yet we're going to wait at least a couple days to see if we can't get the whole state to work together on this, because there is the benefit of all of us doing this together. In terms of how we respond to the COVID situation as individuals, stay home, wash your hands, practice good hygiene. There are ways that we can take actions as individuals to lessen the impact to our healthcare system. It isn't only that we have so many COVID cases that we overwhelm the system. It's that when we do that, we cannot do the other things that need to be done. I have a family member who he's considering cancer surgery, and now it's like, is that going to happen or not? What's the uncertainty associated with all the healthcare kind of scrambling to address the problem? So I'll own that there's a tension between kind of decentralized and centralized. I think that's inherent and intentional in our country to try to solve problems using the best of both, understanding that each has its pros and cons, and you're kind of stuck with the system you are. Not to say we can't find ways to improve and change where we can, but we're never going to go one way or the other completely.
My take on this is that it's, in my view, less about centralization or decentralization. It's more about voluntary versus compulsory. In other words, places where people are allowed to make their own choices versus they're forced to at the threat of violence. And so for me, that's extremely important, not only as a Christian, because I believe that you can't compel people into morality. You can't put a gun to their head and tell them, pray this sinner's prayer after me. Now you're born again. Congratulations. We understand and acknowledge that that's not okay on a variety of different levels. When it comes to politics or how we organize society, I think that you can extend that same idea that moral action has to be voluntary. In other words, you can't put a gun to someone's head and say, you must love your grandma. That doesn't work that way. It's not going to be credited to their account, so to speak, even if they do the action in an empty way. So when it comes to this particular COVID-19 thing, the issue here for me is whether there's voluntary solutions or not. And I think we're actually better off, safer because of voluntary solutions than top-down controlled solutions. So I think the important thing to remember here is people are messy. Therefore, society is messy. Markets are messy. When you see new solutions to really complicated problems start to emerge, it's going to be very chaotic. For you, Robby, you saw that happen in this neighborhood, this incredible burst of voluntarism and everybody coming out to help. But the lack of organization for that first period is pretty challenging. And you will always see that when it comes to a crisis and a response to it. The question is whether you're going to get a one-size-fits-all chaos that looks somewhat ordered, but it's going to have massive collateral damage for the situations it doesn't fit, or whether you're going to have a true messy set of solutions that start to emerge into some best practices and things like that. So for example, when it comes to the one-size-fits-all approach, there's a lot of unintended consequences for these types of decisions that are being made by public health officials. I have a friend in Florida who told me that he would shop at 1:00 in the morning for himself and for loved ones because he'd go when there were no crowds in the store. And then public health officials imposed a curfew, forcing everybody to shop at the same hours of the day, meaning it's now crowded and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to maintain that 6-foot boundary. So in Los Angeles officials just forced a bunch of restaurants that had converted into pop-up grocery stores to close because they want everybody apparently shopping at the same grocery stores at the same time. These are severely lacking policies when you think about their goals and their stated intentions. But because it's a one-size-fits-all approach, it's actually forcing people to not find better alternatives. Those pop-up restaurants are an expression of people's desire and need to earn money, to be able to help each other, and also to have better alternatives to the, let's all shop at the store at the same time and snuggle in line. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And this is, I think, a big difference between how markets and free people work in terms of voluntary solutions. I think that if we were to allow that to happen in a more emergent way, yes, you would find that it's messy to start with, but you'd also find that the response of organization through the chaos would become rapidly visible. So airlines, for example, have been incredibly hard hit by this. I think what you would see is their incentive if you allow free people and free markets to work, is that if they knew that they had both a need to keep customers happy and safe in the middle of this situation, and they also had a need to avoid liability for concern over someone getting infected on one of their flights, you would see tens of billions of dollars of energy and money and creativity focused on how do we create lightweight solutions that keep everybody safe while still getting people on flights, maintaining freedom of movement, and maintaining a free and open society. You can imagine them, instead of walking through a security checkpoint, walking through an ultraviolet like disinfectant light, for example, where you have to get disinfected, your stuff has to get swabbed down, like you have to provide a voluntary app check-in showing your locations for the last days in relationship to other people that maybe were infected. You would see an entire system of like social tracking that could protect privacy and do it in a way that also balances out consumer needs. And you would see this stuff emerge, I think, in a matter of weeks. It would be very chaotic and uncomfortable at first, but in a matter of weeks, we would be back to travel and work, and probably the spread of this would be massively reduced, while you also reduce the economic harms. It's hitting tens of millions of people. You know, we're facing 30% unemployment, which has never, ever happened in this country. And tens of thousands of excess suicides are predicted because of a recession, just like the 2008 recession. We're talking about something multiples like this. That exceeds the total number of fatalities from COVID-19 right now, just from the expected excess suicides. So it's not okay to just think the way that public health officials do, which seems to be, if you have an infected toe, you cut off the leg and the head too in order to prevent the infection from spreading. Markets have to think differently about this. Politicians think differently when it comes to solutions and problems. They have political considerations. They don't have to balance out the needs and desires of consumers. They don't have to be responsive to those because they don't have to see the consumer decisions of what they're going to buy and not buy, what trip they're going to take and not take on a scale of millions of people every day. They don't have to be responsive to that. They have to be responsive to political considerations that don't necessarily make us safer. In fact, they may actually wind up harming us while pretending as if they're keeping us safe.
I've got a couple comments on that, Ian. I think your estimate of how fast airlines would innovate a ultraviolet cleansing system is a little aggressive. I would be surprised if they could come up with something in a matter of weeks. The science does take a while to get right. I'm not going to sit here and deny that if airlines came up with a cleansing system, the government would approve it in a week. We all know that that's unlikely.
By the way, Ben, if I might just pause you for a second, you said the key word, would the government approve it in a week? The primary barrier to airlines innovating anything from security check-ins all the way through safety things like antiviral things on airlines is not the pace at which the market can move and the organization or corporation can move. It's the pace at which the government will allow them to move, not only for the approval, but the development of it. So there are examples of airlines, for example, solving the security problem more efficiently, but it took them years because government said it has to be TSA agents or licensed TSA contractors. You can't do your own thing. It has to be the same procedure. You can't do different scanners. It has to be this type of scanner, and it has to be done in the following ways. So when you set those types of rules, what you've done is rule out what Israel does, for example, which is highly targeted, specific, intelligence-based screening of security. And instead, what you get is the extremely high touch but useless TSA process where 98% of dangerous items get through TSA and only 2% get caught, but we all have the illusion of being safe. And the airlines would love to make that lower touch. They would love to make that easier, but they're not allowed to. And I think the same thing is true of safety on the planes when it comes to viruses or that type of thing.
Well, and so I think that's a good point. And I'm willing to, own that government can sometimes delay the rollout of innovation, right? I think that can be a fair complaint in some instances, but there is a reason for that. And the reason for that is you get to treat everyone equally. So in the Israel example, if we're going to say, oh, your name has enough Arabic characters in it that we're going to target you for some sort of stop and frisk type policy, that's, I think, against an American ideal of this kind of equal treatment. That equal treatment is what we're trying to value above the speed at which markets can respond.
Yeah, and if I can address that, I think the solution to that in markets is consumer choice. So again, corporations, if they're allowed to respond to consumer demands instead of top-down requirements, they'll actually be more responsive to the needs and desires of people like you and me. So for example, if an airline starts doing screening for its planes, you can't board one of our planes. Let's go back to the security example, unless you go through a background check that we do privately, and we're going to, understand some about your travel. There's privacy considerations or there's profiling concerns. Then there's at least not a universal profiling concern, because airlines can then determine their own policy in response to what you want. So for example, Ben, if you have a concern about that and the way that the process is being run, you have a choice to move over to a different airline. You can move to Southwest. You can move to any dozens of other airlines. And that's typically what happens, is you see a fragmenting in markets so that you don't just have one type of deodorant. This is a really humorous moment, if you recall. I think it was in the lead up to the 2016 election where Bernie Sanders went on one of his, I cannot believe that we have 18 types of deodorant on the store shelves. This is inappropriate when people cannot afford one stick of deodorant. Why do we need 18 choices in deodorant? He did that whole thing. And what he doesn't understand is that markets provide for consumer desires that are so wide and varied that that's what happens, is you wind up with hundreds of different types of deodorant because somebody wants aluminum, someone doesn't want aluminum, someone wants glycerin, someone doesn't want glycerin. So the same thing I think happens when it comes to security and safety, and that would happen in this case too.
I would challenge that there's going to be enough choice to address every concern. If we're putting arsenic in a deodorant because, it makes it last longer on the shelves, there needs to be a government regulator in there to say, no, that's going to kill people. It might kill them in 20 years if you use this deodorant for 20 years, but that's actually a danger to society that we need to make sure we prevent. And so there does need to be some oversight.
I think there's two aspects of that I would consider. One is, for every consumer that is not satisfied with an existing solution, the incentive to create a new competing business increases. So every person like you, Ben, every time somebody else is unhappy with the deodorant that has arsenic in it, you're increasing the demand and the profit motive for somebody else to come in and create an alternative solution. So the scale of those problems is incredible. And I think you'll see things emerge. I don't know if you've ever heard this example of the chicken diaper, but this is one of those examples. It's become possible because of the internet, so-called long tail of the internet that satisfies these incredible niche demands. So for example, somebody out there, who knew this? They were creating diapers for their chickens so their chickens could live in the house. Now, you and I might look at that and think chickens are terrible pets. They're not affectionate. They're going to peck your eyes out while you're sleeping. I don't know. I don't really particularly want chickens in my house. But somebody else out there on that long tail, 0.1% of Americans, less than that, wanted this. But somebody was able to create a multi-million-dollar chicken diaper business on the internet, catering to incredible niche needs like that. And I would suggest that if chicken diapers can succeed, a deodorant without arsenic can succeed without a top-down solution mandating that people not poison themselves.
And so with fungible goods that you buy from Amazon or you buy off the shelf of your grocery store, your argument carries a bit more weight. I still think there needs to be some consumer protection against certain chemicals, not only what's contained in the product that's on the shelf, but in the supply chain processing and the manufacturing. So my degree is from sustainability and looking at what emissions go and how we pollute our rivers and stuff. There's still some situations where that choice is limited. And so if we bring it back to healthcare, I've only got 2 or 3 hospitals that I could drive to, right? There's not as much room as there is on a shelf of a grocery store. On a grocery store, yeah, I've got 18 choices of deodorant and maybe I can mix and match. And if none of them match, I can go online and find, the 19th or the 20th. But in certain situations, healthcare being one, electricity generation being another, there are natural reductions of choice just due to geographic constraints that I think it does mean we have to have some intelligent regulation to step in to just watch the process and help it along.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to in economics is labeled as natural monopolies or public goods.
Or monopsonies.
Yeah.
If you're familiar with monopsony, right? Monopoly is one seller, monopsony is one buyer. So that's what we have in electricity markets.
Yeah, I think that that's a complicated topic that, would probably be a whole episode by itself. Coming back to, let's talk about the public health considerations and real world examples of this. The FDA, for example, a lot of people consider the FDA to be a good example of what you're talking about, because what it does is prevent any types of treatments coming to market that are not proven both safe and effective. The problem is people like Dr. Mary Meeker, have done considerable research on the real world impacts of what happens with the FDA. What happens is that two things. Number one, they allow dangerous solutions to stay on the market longer than otherwise would be. So for example, Vioxx was predicted by a number of free market medical publications to be dangerous before it was taken off the market by the FDA. So the FDA was less responsive when there was a danger. And in addition, they create huge unintended consequences by blocking new treatments from coming to market and making it harder. One way that this manifests is the fact that there are millions of people now who have what's called orphaned diseases. So in other words, they have a condition for which it's not cost effective. It's impossible to bring a solution to market because the number of people and the market size for that illness is actually pretty small. And the FDA makes it cost tens of millions of dollars and take years to develop and bring a drug to market. Whereas you could, without the FDA in place, do free market testing, be very confident about your clinical research behind it, and assume liability for your drugs and put those out there. And I think that's a major consideration too, is that what's happened is when you put these in place, like the FDA, I think you're shielding corporations from liability. And as somebody who's a very free market person, I'm not into shielding corporations from the responsibility of their action. I say stand or fall on the basis of how you serve consumers. If you fail to serve consumers, if you put them at risk, if you make them sick, if you create a plane, for example, that circulates air that gets 100% of those people on that plane sick from COVID-19 because one person was infected, you should be liable for that. And markets provide for that. In the same way, I think if you were to allow incentives around liability and lawsuits and torts to go into place when it comes to drug manufacturing and treatments, you would see that the rate at which new treatments come forward will be much accelerated. And you'll see that those millions of excess deaths created by the FDA disappear while the quality of those treatments go up because you have now market signals, consumers can decide. And now the emphasis is on consumer understanding and using solutions like, for example, a consumer reports for drugs or things like that, who help you to sort through what's safe and effective.
But there's such a huge incentive to hide that necessary information from consumers. So if I'm polluting the river when I'm making my plane or making my deodorant and shipping it across multiple states, the people who live where my factory is, they can't choose to not buy. It's people across state lines who are doing that purchasing and keeping that company in business. Similarly, any sort of long-term effect that's 5+ years is going to be very, very difficult to track back to. Okay, I have tumors. Where did this come from? Right? I have some sort of recurring asthma. Why? And I think the best way to solve that, when you talk about the FDA is causing excess deaths, they're preventing excess deaths somewhere else. So we're just shifting these around a little bit. The best solution is look very carefully. Have someone who has the knowledge and the expertise necessary to understand the chemicals, understand the process, understand the end goal. Consumers don't always, A, have the expertise to understand that, B, even access to that information, and use that regulatory body to say, this is what you can and can't do. And if there are delays in the rollout of certain treatments or certain products, I think that's a trade-off I'm willing to embrace.
So let me highlight that for a second, because I think the ability to coerce people into a one-size-fits-all solution actually creates really perverse decisions like this. So in other words, Ben saying that's a decision I'm willing to make, that's a trade-off I'm willing to make. Well, Ben, with all respect and with a twinkle in my eye, who made you, Lord God of all creation, to tell me what drugs may or may not be effective or safe for me based on my needs? One example of this is the right to try movement. Back in the 1980s, when the AIDS and HIV crisis hit, the FDA blocked people from using and trying life-saving treatments because they were quote unquote off label. And so thousands and thousands of people died as a result of that because the FDA told them you can't put something in your body which PS is going to die anyway in a matter of months if you don't try something different. It was way too long before the FDA finally allowed that to happen. But on top of that, it wasn't until just this last couple of years when right to try became a national option, where you could actually try a drug for somebody who's on their way towards death very quickly. That's just an example of that. It creates very perverse decisions for public health officials who suddenly have the option to put a gun to people's head and say, sorry, you can't try that drug for your crippling condition. And so I think that that is actually a result of some very immoral first principles there when it comes to drugs. The other thing is I think it creates a really dangerous one-size-fits-all thing in terms of impact. So I talked about morality, but let's talk about impact. One of my former startups was kind of a contrarian health startup. And we came in with an understanding that carbs and sugar in particular were driving a lot of the chronic disease epidemic in the United States. For example, issues with blood sugar, heart disease, cancers, Alzheimer's. These have all been tied very closely with something called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is driven largely by sugar intake and carb intake. And so what we set out to do is to understand the latest and best science around this and create a solution. Because of that, I became aware of the scale of this problem and where it came from. And what I found was that back in the 1970s, the USDA food guidelines changed in response to some research by a man named Ansel Keys. The research, the 7 countries study, so-called, resulted in the USDA recommending that people avoid dietary fat, especially cholesterol. And as a result, they ate way more carbs. What happened was you saw chronic diseases like and related to metabolic syndrome explode and go crazy. So instead of reducing heart disease, instead of reducing cancers, instead of reducing the things that the USDA thought based on that one study were going to help, they actually created potentially millions, I think tens of millions of excess deaths. I haven't actually done that study. I would love to talk to an epidemiologist who could actually run that analysis. But you're talking about tens of millions potentially of excess deaths because somebody misunderstood a study and used data in a way that was not appropriate for a one-size-all approach. And Americans have suffered massively for 35 years with bad guidance on that.
You know why Popeye, the cartoon, eats spinach?
Why?
Somebody moved a decimal point on accident in a scientific study. And so at one point, cartoonists were looking like, oh, spinach is 10 times better for you than every other salad, leafy green, kale that you can pick. So now Popeye eats spinach. Well, they went back and redid it and said, oops, it's basically all the same, right? But these stories of misapplied science, I think, can be rampant. And I'm not going to sit here and disagree with you that, yeah, when we get the science wrong, we get the resulting outcomes wrong. But I would advocate for safeguards to try to fix that as best we can. And that probably means we need to reevaluate how the FDA approves drugs. And there's I think room for that discussion. I just think that the FDA serves a valuable role. And that's where I want them to do that to the best of their ability. And I want us as a society to enable them to do that well. And there's probably people who would come at them and say, you know, we need to obliterate them or we need to completely reduce their scope. I want to be more in the middle to say, there's things they do well, there's things they do poorly. How can we fix what they do poorly, but still keep their benefit?
Here's a question for you guys. In a lot of this recent COVID-19 stuff, a voice that has really come to leadership is Bill Gates. He has been talking for a number of years about vaccines. He's been talking for a number of years about the need for information sharing between governments to be able to enable a better response for a worldwide pandemic such as this. I'll let maybe Ben, you take a stab at this one first, and Ian, feel free to chime in with thoughts as well. In terms of the necessity for international information sharing to be able to fight problems on a global scale, is that necessary in the globalized world that we live in?
I think information sharing is hugely valuable. China tried to give us a bit of a heads up. I think Ian's outlined some of the ways the US was maybe slow to respond, but that advance notice would have been very valuable in reducing the impact. I think it was Bill Gates who said in 2015 that was like the biggest challenge we face is that we have a pandemic and we can't respond. And here we are 5 years later.
Right.
So yeah, information sharing is hugely valuable. We tried to learn that lesson in our country and after 9/11, where we had intelligence communities weren't sharing information and weren't able to prevent that attack, and now they do. The sharing of information, the sharing of best practices, the sharing of data is valuable. The sharing of equipment is a bit more nuanced, right? If we send a whole bunch of PPE and masks to China and they can't contain it, now we're left without. So that, to me, is a more interesting question than just the sharing of knowledge.
I think you would see that happen a lot more if there was more voluntarism in this type of situation. I think that's true. I think there will be leadership in any given situation like this in markets. This is one thing that I struggled with for a long time, was the idea that if you let markets work, that this is somehow sort of anarchist, that there's not going to be leaders, there's not going to be authority, things like that. And really all that I came around to realize that meant was simply that you don't have coercive ability. You can't force people to not do things or to do things. You have to rely on voluntary action. And that still means that we need leaders. So there will be people like Bill Gates, whether, regardless of what you think of his suggestions or proposals in this, there will be folks who can apply a lot of influence to make a big difference and guide some of the centralization. And that kind of comes back to my comment to Ben earlier, that I don't view this as being centralized versus decentralized. I think you will sometimes have centralized solutions because that happens very quickly and emergently in a market. Let's put it this way. When it comes to repairing and maintaining planes, there's not a lot of diversity of opinion about how to do that safely. All right. There's a checklist that is highly centralized. It's highly screened, and it only gets modified when there's a risk, there's a danger. So that's an example. You don't want your airline mechanics, your airplane mechanics, all just winging it on, I think I'll change that bolt or not today based on how I feel. So those types of solutions are absolutely very important. They emerge best when people are allowed to have initiative and responsibility. And I think that's the same thing that would happen here when it comes to data sharing, is if there's a real value for that, you'll start to see that happen. And there may be central databases of this stuff. There may be a lot of decentralized ways that things get done. And we don't know. I think a lot of this comes down to humility. We don't know what the best answers are. We have to assume that people will make mistakes because people are dumb and people will make stupid decisions at any given time. The question is whether you're going to have a system that amplifies and consolidates those errors, where somebody has a bullhorn and all of their errors become the universal rule for everybody, or whether you're going to allow there to be a testing in a laboratory, so to speak, where you have thousands of different experiments happening all at the same time, and we get to see which ones work best or not. And that's what markets do. You'll start to see what works better and what doesn't, and it won't be at the cost of innocent people at such a massive scale like we're seeing right now.
Markets are really good at solving certain problems. I think that's one of the things that the US has captured and ridden to such economic dominance over the last 50 plus years. We're running into the situation where we are uncovering how markets are singularly focused on making money. And if you don't temper that with, there is value to human life, there is value to avoiding pollution, there is value to other things. It's not that markets are immoral, they're amoral. They don't care. I love when we can find ways to harness markets to solve problems, as long as we're doing it under careful guidance.
So In closing here, and I know you guys got to jump off. Any last thoughts for everybody? Maybe a 30-second thought in terms of something you'd like people to walk away with from this episode?
Yeah, I'd be happy to go first. I think my encouragement to folks would be, it's really easy to see when a man with a bullhorn stands up and says, everybody, we've got to do this one thing, and this is the rule, and it's got to be this way. It's really easy to see how that could be effective and you could get things done that way. But I would actually encourage you to look beneath the surface of that and see the magic of how people can voluntarily solve solutions in ways that markets make possible. One of those great examples of this is the essay I Pencil, which is a classic that helps people understand how millions of people can work together despite the fact that they have totally different values, totally different morals, totally different ideas of how things will get done and should get done. But we can cooperate to create incredibly complex solutions that we take for granted, like a simple pencil in your hand. It takes millions of people around the world working together to create something that no individual knows how to make. And I think that same type of solution can be really effective now, even in crisis, maybe even especially in crisis, that we need to rely on human freedom and ingenuity and not on top-down solutions, because I think that will make us less safe.
Thanks, Ian.
The challenge of COVID-19 is not to be underestimated. I think we bring everything we can to bear on this. The approach of government or individual action, I think, is a bit inappropriate. What I would rather see is what's the fastest way we can address the problem. In some ways, that's government getting out of the way, but in some ways, that's using something like the DPA, Defense Production Act, to say, hey, GM, you now have to make ventilators because that's how we're going to get people to stay alive for the next 3 months, and then you can go back to your normal business activities.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both for your time. Appreciated hearing different perspectives on this massively important issue. Thank you very much for sharing. Keep up the good work. Salt Lake City, Bay Area, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate a fun conversation.
Thanks, Robby. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ben. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in, friends. In light of COVID-19, I want to give you a few next steps. First, if you've been affected by COVID-19, visit praisehands.com/COVID-19 for a list of resources, ideas, and solutions we've compiled that might be useful to you. Second, if you're stuck in your house and are looking for something productive to do, visit praisehands.com/volunteer to join one of our growing volunteer teams. As you invest your spare hours into creative cross-cultural Christianity, you'll connect with a community of like-minded individuals, which is so important in this time of potential isolation. And lastly, speaking of our volunteer team, several members who volunteer for Praise Hands have suffered significant losses of income during this time. For the time being, 100% of dollars donated will go directly towards honoring the work these team members are doing for Praise Hands and helping support them during this time. Make a donation to our tax-deductible 501c3 now at praisehands.com/donate. Again, that's praisehands.com/donate. And if you're listening in the future and still want to give towards this cause, just make a note in the comments field when giving, and we'll make sure it goes to one of our team members who needs it most. Thanks for your support, folks. We'll see you next week.